All right, changing our tack now from from politics to economics. So South Africa should brace itself for a prolonged economic stagnation, employment and livelihood crisis, state collapse and failure of public infrastructure, among other ills. All of this is published in the World Economic Forum's 2022 Global Risk Report that was issued on Tuesday. The report tracks global risk perceptions in business, government and civil society. The risks were grouped under 5 categories: economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal and technological. Now, the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa, the Risk Intelligence member and Vice President of the Executive Committee, Nicola Comninos, joins us now to talk about this. Nicola, good to have you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Morning, Leanne. Great to be with you.
So the report says that there's going to be a prolonged economic stagnation. I mean, saying that an employment crisis is basically the basis of such a prediction. Talk to us about this. I mean, is this prediction basically all doom and gloom as we sit here in 2022?
Yeah, I have to admit, Leanne, it's a really depressed report in terms of some of the comments that were made in there, and particularly the respondents. Only 16% of them across the globe, with 12,000 international leaders being interviewed, are optimistic about global growth. That really covers 124 countries across the world, including developed as well as developing countries. So it really is of big concern, and specifically off the back of the COVID pandemic, the enhanced economic impacts that we've seen, suppressed economic recovery, but unfortunately also unequal economic recovery, where we've seen unequal vaccination rates as well, with some of the poorest countries in the world, only 6% of their population being vaccinated. And so the reality is we're seeing massive impacts on society. We've got a big impact from a health perspective, and that unfortunately then also has a big impact on the economies and holds back in terms of economic recovery. And so specifically in South Africa, as you've mentioned, those top risks, really talking about prolonged economic stagnation. I think the other key issues that were raised in the report, specifically looking across the globe, is some of the top issues are environmental risks and then societal risks in terms of social cohesion being eroded, unfortunately, off the back of the COVID pandemic, and also just a more protectionist approach that many countries are taking. So a very suppressed sort of report, I have to admit, but I am an ever optimist. And so for me, the key thing for us to focus on specifically in South Africa is supporting our entrepreneurs, having more programs that support our small and medium enterprises, and specifically ensuring that we've got support for more businesses that can grow, and leveraging some of the opportunities that we've seen coming out of the pandemic and these massive risks and threats that are posing around the world.
Nicola, one of the big things that it spoke to as well is the talk of state collapse and the failure of public infrastructure. And that's something that we really are very worried about here, particularly in South Africa. I mean, internally, authorities keep promising a turnaround of South Africa's fortunes. Who should really be believed? The South African government or the researchers that are looking from the outside in?
Yeah, so the reality is, Leanne, that this report really does reflect that there are some big structural concerns in South Africa that we've been aware of for a number of years, even prior to the COVID pandemic. And I think the COVID pandemic was really just the last straw on the camel's back, really emphasizing and exposing a lot of those weaknesses in our structures. And so the key thing, again, for me to focus on here, potentially just shifting on a more positive note, is at COP26, the great achievement that we had in terms of getting support and getting that funding support of about $8.6 billion to help with moving to a more carbon light economy, and specifically looking at our production of electricity. And us at the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa in December, having acknowledged the Presidential Climate Commissioner as the risk influencer of the year, given that they were able to secure this funding for South Africa, and given that we were able to really elevate and make sure that we've got a structured plan to move to a lower carbon emission economy. Now, the reality is, as you've mentioned, there are big infrastructure concerns and there are big structural concerns within Eskom. So a lot of the resilience work is also really critical. I'm involved in various committees across the country with support from government to make sure that we give the right amount of support for those types of resilient structures to be put together. It unfortunately does put us in a position where we have to have things like load shedding, but it does help us to further strengthen the infrastructure. And I think just on another note, the World Economic Forum has obviously published this global risk report, but IRMSA will be publishing the South Africa risk report on the 24th of Feb, which will really be unpacking in a lot of detail those key and critical threats in South Africa, but also, as I've mentioned, the opportunities. What are those public-private sector partnerships that we can have to address some of these core issues in terms of making sure that our critical infrastructure doesn't collapse and we're able to partner in terms of addressing some of these threats?
Yeah, looking forward to reading, the more in-depth research into South Africa specific. But, I suppose looking at the particular report that's already been done from the World Economic Forum, and then just putting South Africa into it, it's as you say, it's a hard pill to swallow. I mean, just when we thought that, corruption's a thing of the past and we're hoping to move forward, we've got the Zondo Commission process and its outcomes, hopefully wanting to scare off any malfeasance. Yet the World Economic Forum report also says that there is going to be an explosion of illicit economic activity. So the question, I suppose, is what is your view, given that the Hawks and the NPA have promised to work hard in investigating and prosecuting these perpetrators?
I think the reality is, Leanne, when we look at the situation, this has evolved over quite a number of years. And what is being highlighted now is wrongs of the past that are just being brought to the fore. And it is really a tough time when all of these things are being made more visible. And I'm thinking back of a time in Brazil when they also had a lot of their corruption being made visible. And there was a perception globally at that point in time that the Brazil economy and the Brazilian government was more corrupt than ever. But the reality was that they were actually rooting out the corruption and they were actually addressing it. And because it became so visible, that created that perception. And I think we're in a similar situation in South Africa at this point in time, given that the reality is the spotlight is on what's happened. We're unveiling everything. We've got forces behind wanting to address, wanting to bring to action and bring to call what's been done wrong in the past and make sure that structurally we ensure that there are the right processes in place that these don't happen in the future. So for me, I think the reality is we have to make sure that we support our whistleblowers. I think that's one critical thing for me that we as South Africans can do better in both the public and the private sector. We've had some of our whistleblowers have to leave the country for their own personal safety and for fears. And so things like that and making sure we've got structures in place that create support for those types of individuals that are actually brave enough to unveil these corruption activities and making sure that they get addressed. And I think the other one is just making sure that we actually support and make sure that structural reform is being implemented, because at the heart and core of this is the social inequalities and the massive social divide that we are noticing in South Africa, given we've got one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, which just means there's a massive gap between our richest and our poorest. And it's just widened so much further with the COVID pandemic, where the World Economic Forum report talks about another 51 million people moving into poverty. So the reality is we have to make sure that from a societal perspective, we address those deep social inequalities, which we also mentioned in the IRMSA report. And the only real practical way to do that is by creating more jobs, more employment. And so again, as I've mentioned right at the start, is initiatives such as supporting entrepreneurs, making sure we support SMEs. I'm the JSE's Group Chief Risk Officer, and we've got an SME accelerator program. We also just launched our private placement platform, and both of these might not be very commercially viable for us as an entity, but it's critical for us and other businesses to make sure that we have these types of initiatives that might not be in the short term or even a medium or long term commercially viable, but will make a difference in the South African economy.
Well, one can only hope, because I mean, you know, it just is. It's not a rosy picture looking forward. I mean, the report again stating that by 2024, developing economies, and this of course excludes China, will have fallen 5.5% below their pre-pandemic expected GDP growth, while advanced economies will have surpassed it by almost a percentage point, widening this global income gap, which you've been talking about. I mean, we see it here, we live it every day, the gap between the rich and the poor, and it is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I know you speak to some of the programs that are in place, but you know, the reality is that what more needs to be done? I mean, yes, investing in entrepreneurs, and that is a very big thing. But how do we get an economy to grow? Because we will never create jobs unless this economy starts growing. And these predictions, I mean, these are devastating for the country.
Yeah. So, Leanne, I think one of the other big opportunities for me when I look at this massive threat in terms of the social divide is one of the big risks that was obviously highlighted in the report, given the environmental risks. And in the next 10 years, the World Economic Forum's top 5 risks are all related to environment. So we talk about climate change, and there's a big focus on a just transition, ensuring that we get to a lower carbon economy. And the reality is, for countries like ourselves, where we have a huge amount of people employed in high carbon emission industries, that will be a very slow transition. And there's a big and important opportunity there for us to very gradually transition those resources into lower carbon jobs and job profiles. And that really will take some time. And I think for me, the real opportunity is to bring in some skills, to get the right level of support so that we understand exactly how do we move those individuals, how do we create more opportunities for those that are currently not employed? I mean, in South Africa, we get so much sun on the African continent. We really have a massive opportunity to actually leverage wind turbine farms, leverage our sun in terms of various other forms of energy being generated, which obviously doesn't include coal. So it really is such a big opportunity just looking at our natural resources that we do have, and we can, through that, potentially create more opportunities. But the reality is, as I've mentioned, these might not be commercially viable in the very short term. So for me, it's very important for us to partner with others, such as our peers and at the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa, such as Business Leadership South Africa, and making sure that we've got initiatives in place that might not be commercially viable for industries in the very short term, but that can create more jobs in the long term. And then the other element that we always talk about in South Africa is just education. The reality is we have to improve the level of education. If we don't have the grassroots and the basic level of understanding across the board in our society, then we will not be able to create more jobs, more opportunities for South Africans. So really structural reform and ensuring that we implement a lot of those proposals that have been included in the National Development Plan is so critical.
Yeah, and in haste, in a matter of haste, not taking time on doing all of this. I mean, we were just running a story in the news talking about, you know, importing potatoes and the market being flooded with imported potatoes. I mean, we have got so much arable land, and this is something that we can do. You know, you speak to the land, the weather, the terrain. This is something that we need to use to our benefit, create jobs, and you know that's the one way of doing it. As I let you go, you know, South Africans are always referred to as a nation of resilient people. We know this. You know, considering that the people continue to function in such a state of things, which really is compounded by gloomy predictions. And it blows my mind how South Africa just keeps on going. I mean, we've been told that we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. You know, at what stage, if we don't fix things, will we see a breaking point?
So, Leanne, the numbers unfortunately don't look very rosy. A number of economists are predicting, and the World Bank themselves are only predicting about a growth rate around 2% this year and below 2% next year, which, as you've mentioned, obviously then unfortunately erodes some of the growth that we've seen over the last decade. Specifically in South Africa, but also in other developing countries. So the reality is, from an economic growth perspective, there are big concerns. So the big opportunity for us there is in terms of partnership on the rest of the continent. As I've mentioned, there's lots, and you've mentioned it, lots of arable land across the continent. There's a lot of opportunities for solar plants and other types of electricity generation that can contribute to low carbon economy. And there's a big ask across the world to make sure that we address climate change. So the African continent itself can partner and rally the troops to make sure that we are the solution for the rest of the world's big concern, given the number one risk highlighted in the World Economic Forum top risk report is climate change, and it is the environment. And the African continent has sun, and we have a huge amount of land available. So for me, it really is going back to that opportunity.
All right, we leave it there. Thanks so much for talking to us here on the program. Nicola Comninos, who is the risk intelligence member at the Institute of Risk Management South Africa, walking us through the latest World Economic Forum 2022 Global Risk Report and its focus on South Africa in particular. We need to take a quick break, and we'll say goodbye to our SABC2 viewers after.